You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast. And welcome to Spookulative Evolution.
Hello, David.
Crackle, crackle, Will.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 3 of Spook-E 2024. This is our annual Halloween October series where we investigate how could creatures that represent some of our favorite mythical monsters and critters come to be via natural selection and evolution.
Yeah, using the good real-world biological toolkit to make monsters.
Yes. This year we're doing tiny monsters.
Tiny monsters, it's been so much fun.
Itty-bitty ones. We've done gremlins.
Yep.
And we did fairies.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're doing the salamander.
Yeah, this one, it should be super easy.
Right?
It's salamander right there. Done.
Basically done.
And cut.
Light it on fire. Good to go. This series, we are just having fun. We're not trying to make any definitive statements about the evolution of these monsters, nor the official version of these monsters, because there's usually not a single official version of the monsters. Just having fun, just being silly. This episode, the salamander is our monster, which is a very classical, bestiary, medieval monster. Mm-hmm. This one is one of those classics. I don't know if it's as famous as... I always thought of it as a classic traditional one, but I don't actually know if it's as commonly known among people. So if you already knew the salamander, I'd love to hear whether this is your first time hearing about this critter or if you knew about them.
Yeah, I'm vaguely familiar with myths of salamanders, but I notice you keep using it in the singular, which makes me suspect that I don't understand it.
You're right. It is salamanders, but it's often just called the salamander.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it's not
like the Hydra.
No, it's not a singular monster.
One. Gotcha.
This is a classic scenario that happened with a lot of, old and, medieval especially, interpretations of animals, where this is a mystified version of the real animal, the salamander. Right. So this is an actual animal, but they've added on a number of fantastical features. Salamanders are amphibians, pretty common. They're found around most parts of the world. They are well known in areas where these myths were coming from, like ancient Greece and medieval Europe. The legendary salamander got described quite a while ago and has kind of gone through this interesting pattern where it started out pretty normal to the actual animal with a couple of embellishments that then ramped up as time went on and got more ridiculous in certain regards. It was often depicted as typical salamander shape or just a lizard, which is pretty darn close.
Sure. And lizards and salamanders are commonly confused.
Yes.
And also very reasonably confused.
They're living in similar environments a lot of the time, especially salamanders that live on land.
Yeah, they have a very similar shape. They're usually quite small, and it's hard to see details on them. So, yeah, that's your generic herp.
Yeah, they're often eating bugs, so it's like... They are filling a very similar role, especially just in the mind of people.
Yes.
They're similar animals. The thing that made these early depictions stand out is their association with fire. Mm-hmm. They were depicted to live in fire, or sometimes be associated with elemental fire, or be able to resist fire.
Okay.
But some association with fire. These kinds of descriptions go back to ancient Greece, and there are reports from Aristotle and Theophrastus who described the salamander in ancient texts. So we're talking like 300 BCE and thereabouts. These were referred to as salamandra. Sometimes they were referred to as sora for lizard.
Sure.
So sometimes they were grouped with lizards.
Yep. I think salamandra is also a genus of modern salamanders.
Yes, it is. Theophrastus noted them as lizards that emerge with the rain.
Okay.
So
cool.
even
that's a pretty apt description of just a salamander.
Right? They were not too far off. They even described them as used in poisonous potions, sometimes called the sorcerer's lizard. Most famously, description is from Pliny the Elder, which is dating to 70 to 20 CE, so right after we turn over into the modern counting way. Pliny the Elder is famously noted as one of the earliest naturalists.
Yeah,
at least
that
written
name
down.
has come up before on Spook-E.
Exactly. Pliny the Elder was an ancient academic who recorded a ton of info about the natural world. He's famous for being one of the first to write down texts about the natural world. So probably not the first one making these observations, but one of the earliest documented, like systematically documented texts about the natural world and just observations of animals' behaviors and lifestyles and roles in the environment. Pliny's description is very salamander. Animal like a lizard in shape with body speckled all over. Never comes out except during heavy storms and goes away the moment the weather becomes clear. And even made a distinction between salamanders and lizards.
Cool.
So just a salamander. All of these descriptions fit the alpine salamander of Europe, or fire salamander, which is a speckled salamander found in this area. Then there are some extra traits that Pliny recounts, probably from those older texts, and attributes to the salamander. Ability to extinguish fire with the frigidity of its body.
Huh.
So that was often a thing that came up, is that they can put out fires because they're such cold animals.
Yeah. Interesting.
In later books that Pliny wrote, he views this with skepticism. So he did not hold this all the way through, but in some of his early things, he noted this ability. In the later, when he's skeptical about it, he notes that you should just be able to test this. Like,
right.
Surely if this were true, we could just show it.
Right. All you need is a salamander and some fire.
So surely we would have if that were the case. But it still got out there in those early texts and probably bolstered the myth. It vomits from its mouth a milky salve, or slaver, saliva, one touch of which on any part of the human body causes the hair to drop off.
Huh.
Yep. The portion touch changes its color and breaks out in a rash, basically, a tetter. So has some of those fantastical qualities. There are some that are this interesting blend of accurate and over-exaggerated.
Mm-hmm.
Notes that they're poisonous.
Yeah.
Which indeed, the alpine and fire salamander are some of the salamanders noted for their toxicity.
Yes. There are plenty of amphibians with toxins.
Absolutely. And the salamanders living in this area that fit the description Pliny was using are indeed some of the more notably toxic salamanders. So it's very fitting. These are salamanders that can also like actively secrete toxin when they're threatened. The extent of this toxin was greatly exaggerated.
Yes.
Which is very common with poisonous animals, especially poisonous monsters in ancient texts. It was said that a single salamander was so toxic that if it twines around a tree or climbs a tree, all the fruit of that tree will be poisoned, and anyone who eats it will be poisoned and killed. And if it falls into a well, all who drink from it will die. Those two descriptions are the most consistent things for the poison of the salamander. That trees they climb on poison the fruit, wells they fall in poison the water.
Cool.
Those show up over and over again in descriptions of the salamander, so they are supposed to be incredibly toxic. Which we've encountered with lots of monsters in Spook-E. The Hydra was like that. Dragons were like that. Very often, a way to make monsters monstery in old texts is their poison is so poisonous it can kill, even if it drips into the water supply or kills crops and stuff like that. It seemed like this was a pretty popular view of the salamanders at this time. There is a bas relief, a sculpture of sorts, carving of a salamander straddling a crossbeam in what seems to be an anvil and forge scene, and is interpreted as a blacksmith facility in Pompeii. So it seems like salamanders in association with fire and smiths was a more common thing than just Pliny saying so.
Yeah.
These things continue as we go forward. We're in like the 2nd and 3rd century. There's a Roman author that notes salamanders being drawn to the fires of forges to put them out. That they're a nuisance animal that will scurry into forge fires and put them out.
Cool.
Yep. Notes specifically in their version that salamanders are not born of fire, which does come up in some versions, that they are born of the fire. It says, unlike the pyrusta, which is a 4-legged insect that is indeed born of the fire.
Sure, of course.
Distinction there. We want to make sure we don't get our creatures crossed. So there was this idea of its relation to fire kind of varies as people interpret it. Some that it's putting it out, some that it lives in the fire, some that it's born from the fire, some that it feeds on the fire. There were even Jewish and Christian interpretations as the salamander as an allegory for passing through flame and like surviving flame. St. Augustine even took it as an example as proof of purgatory, that if the salamander can survive flame, that means not all things engulfed in flame are burned, which means there indeed could be a place of internal flame. And so took it like the salamander was used as a important example for this theological philosophy question.
That's interesting.
Which is, I thought that was pretty cool. There was a famous tale in the 1200s from an English writer of a salamander laying waste to Alexander the Great's army because it fell in the river that they drank from and killed 4,000 soldiers and 2,000 men. Of course, there's no actual proof of this.
Sure.
But this was a popular tale, evidently, at least perpetuated by this writer, that it had major historical impact. Leonardo da Vinci had an addition to the salamander that it had no digestive organs and it gets its food only from fire. That it doesn't have any digestive organs because it doesn't eat. It takes nourishment from the flame.
Right. It's like Superman.
Yes.
It just persists off of the heat and the light.
Yep. And which the fire constantly renews its scaly skin.
Right. Naturally.
Right.
Famously scaly salamanders.
Which is going to come up as we continue. Their skin becomes a notable thing in some later renditions, which is weird. There was another alchemist that confirmed Leonardo da Vinci's interpretation of their diet, and elevating the salamander to a status of one of the 4 elementals, that it was actually an elemental of fire.
Gotcha.
That it's an embodiment of elemental flame.
Yeah, I believe in at least modern Dungeons and Dragons, the creatures, the salamanders in D&D are elemental creatures.
Yep.
They're made of fire.
Yeah, yep. And so there's this idea that they are of the flame.
Mm-hmm.
As we move into the higher Middle Ages, there are some of the more like ridiculous depictions of salamanders, some of which kind of seem to lose the thread a bit, and really, because the early depictions were salamanders with benefits,
right,
with extra attachments on,
upgrades.
Yep. Then these really become just other creatures in some instances. They retain their association with fire a lot of the time, some retaining a semblance of being a salamander, but there are also pictures of salamanders that look like a satyr-like creature, so like goat, half goat people, worm-like creatures coming from the flame, a winged dog, a small bird in the flames. So
weird.
It starts to just become flame-related animals.
Yeah, just the word salamander, just for anything fiery.
Yes.
Huh. A flame bird already has a name.
Right?
That's a different creature.
And it's not the only time that it'll be kind of associated with the phoenix.
Yeah.
That does come up later. Some of the bestiaries talked about salamanders not only being impervious to flame and most poisonous of all poisonous creatures, or serpents. It was sometimes grouped in the serpent category.
Not surprising.
Like lots of your...
We talked about
evil creatures.
Last year with dragons. Serpent is a very popular descriptor.
That it dwells and survives in the fire. It can extinguish it. Enters hot water, and the water will become cold.
Okay.
Which is an interesting one.
Keeping that cold body thing.
And started propagating the myth that salamanders love carrots.
Huh.
I didn't see anything about that past this. Evidently, it was a thing that came up sometimes in bestiaries, but...
Weird.
Well,
the reason is because there was an early cartoon appearance of a salamander that was actually making a reference to a popular movie at the time. Right? But nobody remembers the movie, but they remember the salamander eating the carrot.
Yep.
Now that's what everybody thinks. Now everybody thinks salamanders like carrots.
It's so... The salamander has gone all over the place.
That was, for anybody who was completely lost there, rabbits.
Yes.
That's what happened with rabbits.
Rabbits are not famous carrot eaters.
No, just Bugs Bunny.
Just Bugs Bunny. There's a whole bunch of like alchemical and culinary and medical things that are famous for salamanders. The heart of a salamander extinguishes the fire of fever and lust.
Oh, that's so like
right?
where the fire as a metaphor.
Yeah. So there's definitely this idea of the concept of flame.
Yeah.
Working with them.
Also fever and lust.
Yes.
Very fun combination.
Right? Newt's eye and stuff like that in witch potions is a famous association with, because newts are a kind of salamander.
Yep.
Most likely, and I've heard this other places, referring to mustard seeds, that a lot of those which ingredients that you hear are just code words, basically.
For plants.
For much more normal herbal ingredients and stuff.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's a cool idea.
And they've just gotten hyped up because we like to villainize people who practice.
Eyes are creepy.
Yeah, and those that kind of medicinal practitioners. They also became famous in European heraldry. Salamanders would be typically depicted as a lizard or a dragon with blazing fire around them, so they would show up on banners and shields and stuff. In early modern French folklore, they started getting things like powerful poison breath, which is not surprising. Lots of poisonous things were also thought to be able to breathe their poison. Mm-hmm. Their toxic breath was evidently so strong that it could swell a person until skin broke.
Ah.
Yep, that's gross. Supposedly did the same thing to herds of cattle and gained the name the bellows breath. They also noted that the salamander breathed seldomly, which is an interesting kind of accurate parallel to real salamanders, and that the only way to kill it was to lock it in a confined space so that its own breath would poison it.
That interesting, the implication that they are not resistant to their own poison.
Yes, absolutely. I always find that interesting when monsters' things get turned back on themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that one, Pliny the Elder would be pretty happy, because that is experimentally provable.
Right?
You put a salamander in a closed box, it's going to die.
Yep.
You just got to wait.
Now we get to the actually weird part of the salamander myth. All of that was pretty benign compared to
the preamble.
Yeah. Salamander plumage.
Huh.
is a classic thing that comes up with a lot of salamander myths.
Okay. Plumage, in my experience, usually means feathers.
Yep.
Okay.
So the salamander was said to, in some versions, to be enclosed in a silky membrane that was fireproof itself. One quote was, from the salamander comes a material that is unlike any other cloth. When it becomes dirty, it must be thrown into fire, which will consume the dirt without harm of the cloth. The cloth is made in the deserts of India and worn by important people. There are other descriptions like this in Chinese documents. The Chinese salamander was described to grow long hair that could be woven. Cloth was unharmed by fire and could be cleaned by burning. It was washed with fire. Arab and Persians described a mixed description of the salamander, sometimes similar to the phoenix, so sometimes kind of interchangeable. Also had a marten-like animal that was said to yield similar cloth. And,
okay. Well, that at least a marten is
right?
Is furry.
Yep. And a lot of these, people have pointed out, fit the description of asbestos.
Oh.
Yeah. So asbestos is a mineral found in the ground, but can be made into a cloth-like material that we use for fire-resistant clothing and insulation. Asbestos is incredibly fire-resistant.
Yeah.
And if you make asbestos cloth, you can put it in fire and it will burn the soiled stuff in it out, but the cloth is fireproof.
Oh, interesting.
So asbestos fits all the descriptions.
Yeah.
But at some point, this cloth and salamanders got connected, probably due to the fire myths of salamanders.
Yeah. Well, it also has a little bit of that witch description, like you were saying before, the idea of instead of this just being a normal ingredient that you can get somewhere, it comes from the body of an animal, and it is used by those people way out east, that sort of Eastern mysticism idea.
Yep. It's likely what happened is that it became metaphorically known as salamander's wool because of the fireproofing nature. That was just a name for it. And then at some point,
seriously
that got taken literally. And that's why you'll find bestiary pictures of furry salamanders.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
I love that there is a trend in the history of the salamander myths of misinterpretations of fictional features giving rise to more fictional features.
Yes. Yep. This one is fun also because this one has lasted to the modern day in a certain way that the International Association of Heat and Frost Insulators and Allied Workers uses the salamander as their mascot logo.
That's cool.
That's still to this day, it is on their logo. Now, connecting salamanders to fire may seem real random.
Sure.
Because salamanders are wet, slimy, non-warm-blooded animals.
Yes.
So that seems like a real stretch. The common thinking is that the reason this got connected is due to fires being started with logs that had salamanders hiding in them.
Yes, I've heard that.
Yep.
Because inside of a nice damp log, right, that's often a place that's cool and dark. It's full of bugs. It might be a little bit damp.
Mm-hmm.
Great place for a salamander to hang out.
Nice shelter to protect yourself from predators.
Yep. Until it gets set on fire.
Yes. So they might be inside the rotting log or in between the bark and the log is a nice place for them to squeeze in. So probably it's that while people would gather logs from the forest, start a fire, and then they'd see salamanders emerge from the wood pile.
Yep.
And that got this idea of, they came from the fire.
Yep. That would also make sense with that insect that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
That thought to be born from the fires. Yeah, if there were bugs in the log, now they're coming out of the log.
I've had that happen when I was in Scouts, of us putting logs in the fire and then watching spiders flee the fire circle as the smoke starts to come in. There's a accounting from an Italian artist in the 16th century witnessing this happening when they were a child.
Okay.
And so there are documents of people being like, I've seen it happen. It's, once again, provable by experimentation.
If you put enough logs in a fire,
you start a fire.
You get salamanders, and you put them in a room, and then they die.
This idea of them coming from, like, campfires and stuff was in other myths. One of the Jewish or Christian myth, but that they would come from a fire if it was burnt in the same place for 7 days. So if the fire was set in the same area for enough time, then it would summon a salamander effectively. There were also some that tried to explain how they were resistant fire with some of the more like biological senses. Salamanders are known to produce a milky substance because they can exude that toxin.
Sure.
And it was thought that this was fire retardant. That basically, you became gooey.
Right.
So you can put out the fire around you or survive the fire. I saw one thing that said, this probably is true for at least a little bit.
Right. Well, it's like when you put the stuff on your hand.
Yeah.
I was like, you could stick it in the fire for a second.
Yeah, well, if you dunk your hand in water, you can grab a hot pot for a little bit longer than someone with dry hands.
Yes.
But that water's only going to last so long. There are other ideas of how they got associated with fire. I saw one that was an idea that misinterpretations of Egyptian hieroglyphics might have had a role. That there is a hieroglyph of a salamander used by Egyptian priests to represent a man who is burnt, but there also seem to be other versions that to represent a man who's died of cold. That might have gotten confused. From what I saw, this isn't an accurate interpretation of those hieroglyphics.
Right.
But that that there are like accounts of that being what that is, and that might have gotten or helped the association.
Yeah.
And it could also be just that early groupings of animals, especially in medieval texts, would often group like crawling things and serpents together with dragons and stuff. So it could just be some of those things that helped bolster. Now, like these mentalities go back before those medieval myths, but they might have gotten bolstered just by it's a tiny dragon.
Right.
Done.
Association with another creature that is associated with fire.
So salamanders, very odd repertoire of special skills that you don't hear about in documentaries.
Yeah, exactly. That's they don't tell you about this.
Yeah, big naturalist doesn't want you to know that they actually are the Human Torch. Interestingly enough, while I see lots of modern interpretations of salamanders being like kind of like little dragons, fire breathing or made out of fire, I did not find that described in any of the classic myths, that they breathe fire or can set things on fire. They are immune to fire. They can feed off fire. Fire can replenish them, and they can put out fire.
Yeah.
Not once did I see anything that described them wielding fire.
I guess you mentioned some that they were of fire.
Yes.
Maybe they're made of fire.
That they are born of the fire.
Right.
But even then, they were never like flaming salamanders. It's just, they are a creature from fire.
Interesting.
So they are not fire-breathing salamanders.
Yes.
Which is how a lot of, like I said, modern media and stuff.
And that's the association, for sure, with stuff like dragons.
Yep.
When, in our sort of modern approach to mythology and creature creation, if a thing is associated with fire, it almost always can breathe fire.
Yep.
That's just an easy superpower to get.
Yeah, it was like making superheroes strong. That's just a very easy way to make them be able to do cool stuff.
Yes.
But they don't breathe fire. They don't set things on fire. They don't start fires. That's also something that I didn't find anywhere in their stuff. They never start fires. They are immune to them or can put them out.
Yeah, they end fires.
Yeah. So even
They
though...
start in fires.
Yeah. So they are not fiery salamanders.
So the idea of them being fiery salamanders is a modern misinterpretation of several layers of ancient misinterpretations.
Well, it's like you were saying, it's led to yet another superpower being added on to this mythical version of the creature.
Yeah, man, imagine what salamanders are going to be capable of in another few hundred years.
Imagine what you'll know tomorrow.
How about salamanders? They're flying into space.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. Because, where does fire come from? The sun.
The sun, that's where salamanders
That's where salamanders originally were born, obviously.
And one of them was sent to Earth to protect us. And thank goodness was raised by a nice couple in Kansas.
Yeah, so they are a very interesting creature.
I know Superman doesn't come from the sun. Someone out there. So I know that he didn't come from the sun.
No, he came from Krypton's sun, silly.
He came from Krypton's sun. He was born inside the red sun.
Yeah, suns are Krypton eggs.
Yes, that's where suns are born.
Mm-hmm. Son of Krypton. That's what he's called.
Prodigal sons.
He's called the son of Krypton.
That's him.
Yeah.
Inside of him.
The typo is that it's an O in a lot of the comics. It's meant to be a U.
There's a little sun. So sorry for that nonsense digression to all the nerds out there.
This is a very interesting creature to me because though it has a bunch of crazy abilities, it's also fairly benign.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. Like, it's never described as malicious.
Yeah, this is the first monster so far of the year that isn't actively harming people.
And so it's not it never do they describe it attacking people. I never found a single story. I'm sure there are some out there maybe, but I didn't come across any stories of them attacking. It's always like, yeah, if it falls in your well, your town is in trouble. It didn't jump into the well.
Yeah, it's not an intentional going after people.
This thing being around puts out forge fires and poisons people and poisons livestock. It's just a dangerous creature to be around.
Yeah.
There's an anime of a guy who gets like splashed with some chemicals and gets deadly BO. And it's like a little anime short, and it's this whole thing of him trying to deliver a package and like the military having to try to stop him because he's poisoning towns. It's just like that. It's just this thing is just moving through areas, killing people by being itself.
Yes.
This is one of the interesting ones for the magic disclaimer because there's a whole bunch of these that depending on how much of which of the versions of the myth we go with, it gets more and less magical. Mm-hmm. But magic disclaimer, we will not be able to do all the things. They can't be born of fire, etc.
Sure.
These are not elemental creatures of fire. We can only do the things that we can biologically evolve. But, that being said, how do we evolve a fire-associated salamander?
Yeah. So this is an interesting one to think about. So as usual, we want to think about how do the monstery features come about through natural selection, and where do we start from?
Yes.
What is our ancestry on the Tree of Life?
What group of life best fits this?
Now, this one's interesting because so much about them is true to actual real-life salamanders.
Yeah.
But the fire thing is not only is a close association with fire a weird thing for any animal to have because fire bad.
Yep.
But salamanders in particular are amphibians who require moisture.
Yes.
Like they live in damp areas. They need to be by water. Drying out is worse for a salamander than it is for many other animals.
Yeah. So we're kind of in the interesting scenario of we either have to figure out how to get a salamander to fit within a fire situation or something else that might make more sense and then become very salamandery.
Yeah. Well, lizards feel like another good starting point option because very similar to salamanders overall. They came up in the discussion and they have the same general shape and lifestyle as salamanders tend to.
Yeah.
So our salamander could also be a lizard.
It definitely could.
That gets called that. For a little while, I was thinking about both lizards and salamanders have the habit of growing display structures that can be spines or frills or external gills for salamanders. And I had the thought early on that, oh, you could have some of those that were orange and yellow and mobile so that it looks like the creature is on fire.
Mm-hmm.
But then you pointed out that they usually aren't on fire.
Yeah, they're just in fire.
So that could still be a visual indicator to, oh, it's in fire as opposed to on fire. But that feels less important having gotten to the end of the whole discussion.
The one thought I had while working on the notes was that the only thing I can think of that naturally brings salamanders into interaction with fire other than us would be like forest fires.
Sure.
Because salamanders are very commonly forest animals.
Yes.
And there are types of forests that regularly have fires. Fire-dependent forests are a natural type of ecosystem that have, not seasonal, because it's usually not every year.
Sure.
But it's like
regular, it's a cycle.
Yes.
They have a fire cycle.
Like when I was looking up, it was like every 20 years, it was a high average for it. So it's still not like super, super common.
Yep.
But it's still fairly common.
Yeah.
That something like that could be a pressure to evolve behaviors and anatomy that deal with this regular fire threat.
Yes, if you're in an area that you are frequently coming up against fire, that is a real thing in real life.
Yes.
That you have plants in particular will do this.
Absolutely.
Where they develop, like plants whose seeds are fire resistant.
Yes. Or that have to go through a fire to
Yes.
germinate fully.
As far as I know, there aren't fire-resistant animals, but there are animals with behavioral adaptations, right? Burrowing can be a behavioral adaptation to avoid fire. Another thought that I had is that there could also be some sort of benefit to being near fire.
Yes.
So if we're thinking salamanders or lizards, things like that, these are ectothermic animals, which means they get their heat from the surrounding environment. So actively seeking out fire and being behaviorally adapted to not, get yourself all burned up could be a way for them to either warm themselves up, or if they're carrying eggs around to keep the eggs warm. There could be benefits to finding a heat source.
They could also be feeding off of things fleeing, like insects fleeing
Absolutely,
the fire.
That's true.
And so
salamanders fleeing the fire.
Yep.
That's true. That's a thing we've talked about, in particular with the hawks.
Yes.
In some parts of the world, but Australia is famous for this. This actually, we brought this up in some of the dragons.
Yep.
That they will hunt on the edge of a forest fire to catch creatures that are fleeing from the fire.
So I like them in association with forest fires very much, because that's just a very nice natural explanation for them evolving these traits.
Yes. Well, and especially if they started in a part of the world that has frequent fire or just general sources of heat, like a very volcanically active part of the world, which describes certain parts of Europe.
Yes.
Conveniently.
Absolutely.
That you might have a lot of geothermal heat sources.
Ooh, I like
and
that.
like volcanic vents and stuff. And that's where that association with heat gets started. And then that translates very nicely to thriving in areas that get a lot of forest fires or campsites or human civilization.
Yep.
That to one of these creatures, a blacksmith's forge is another geothermal heat source.
Yes, I do like that. One other thought I had in regards to like the things described about them is that they're described secreting a fire retardant coating or mucus, which often was also kind of associated with their asbestos, their plumage.
Yes.
That they had a covering that was fire resistant. And it was giving me the idea of like, what if they burrowed and like kind of cocooned themselves? But then that made me think of lungfish making a mucus cocoon.
Oh, yeah.
That they'll hibernate underground during dry seasons and stuff and burrow down in the mud and then secrete this mucus coating that becomes like a sack around them.
Yeah.
To maintain the moisture and water so that they can brumate through that tough time. I could absolutely see that being something that would help an animal during forest fires of like, yeah, I mean, you smell smoke, dig down, hibernate, and create your mucus sac, and just wait it out. The soil will protect you from some of the heat, and this will protect you from drying out.
I could also see a logic to, because one of the issues you have with being, and when I was saying it before, that a small cold-blooded animal might benefit from going near a heat source. The problem with that is that you're cold.
Yes.
To start, which means that you're going to have a hard time moving quickly if you need to get away from that heat source. But if they are creating some sort of external barrier, that might give them a little bit of extra time to warm up if they are near enough to fire that they can then become active and run away from it as they need to.
It might also give them a way to avoid overheating. Because that's the other thing I thought about the danger of using fire as your heat source is it's like a heat lamp where you could accidentally bake yourself if you...
Yeah, and this is a really important note to make, because I was thinking about this when I said it before too. There's a reason animals don't use fire as their heat source, because that's super dangerous. The sun is right there.
Yeah, well, and like the fact that our ancestors started doing that is that's extremely weird, and that is a hardcore way to survive.
What you're suggesting is that these are salamanders that have learned to make fire.
Yes, these are flint and steel using salamanders. So like the idea that they could be using that mucus as not a fire extinguisher, but as basically
a fire shield,
sunscreen for the fire.
Yeah,
I do kind of like that.
Well, I'm glad that you've put it in this direction, because this is one of my thoughts that I had. So they're also described as toxic.
Yes, now, extremely so.
Salamanders, that's not hard to do. Salamanders are often poisonous. If we're thinking lizards or snakes or something, those are often venomous. So not difficult to get that. You also brought up asbestos.
Yes.
And asbestos is also harmful.
Oh, yeah.
So the way that asbestos... This is what I had to Google real quick to make sure that I knew how asbestos worked. Asbestos is, as you said, just a mineral. I think there are multiple different minerals that are called asbestos.
Yes, yeah, there's like a grouping.
But these are minerals whose crystals grow as fibers. They are naturally occurring, and then we have used them for, fireproofing and such. But those little fibers, if they get disturbed and are released into the air, we can breathe in those little fibers, and it can cause damage to your lungs, and it can cause cancer and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, it does kind of the same things that like fiberglass will do, except this one also has a toxicity to it.
Yes.
That is why we no longer use it as insulation in our buildings and stuff.
So, when the fact that they are associated with asbestos and toxic makes me very happily want to put those two things together.
Yeah.
That if this is a creature that grows an asbestos-like coat.
Oh, yeah.
Or something. And this, I could imagine this being a mineralization.
Yes.
Because asbestos is just a mineral, and there are tons of animals that have evolved the ability to incorporate mineralized tissues into their body, that this could be their fireproof coat is little tiny fibrous minerals, and if they get disturbed, or if you touch them, or if you drop them in the water, those little fibrous minerals can get into your system and cause damage. It might not cause all your hair to fall off right away. And I also this is not a thing I know about asbestos. I think asbestos isn't one of those, like, you touch it and you fall over kind of things. No. I think it's one of those, you're exposed to it for a long time and then you have cancer 20 years later.
Exactly.
But if these are little, fibrous crystals, that also isn't terribly different from things like volcanic ash, which can get into your lungs and cause somewhat more immediate effects. Again, it's not going to be an instant thing.
It's one of those where even if it's not as deadly as they were making out, if it affects some people, like an elderly person or an already sick person with damaged respiratory systems, then them getting the asbestos might be a much more serious thing, and enough for people to be like, yeah, no, the salamander poisoned them and they died surprisingly fast.
Yes. I want to say that asbestos inhalation also can lead to other medical difficulties, in addition to, being a carcinogen and stuff, that it starts to interfere with your internal systems, which can make it easier for you to come down with some other problem.
Yep.
So it could also be, for example, if you're a battalion of tired, malnourished soldiers who have been out, putting themselves through very stressful, difficult situations, you get a salamander outbreak, and suddenly a bunch of people are getting sick and having troubles.
Oh, this would also make sense why if they climb a tree, the fruit can be covered in asbestos.
If the stuff is messing with the tree.
Yeah, and it's getting on the fruit that you then go collect and eat.
Yes.
That they can just shed onto the tree, and all you notice is salamander climbed tree, fruit was bad afterward.
This is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Now, it does raise the intriguing question of how do we get a salamander with... Now, the fur would be a tough call. I like the fibrous mineralized tissue. I think that's cool. Having some sort of mineralized integument on the body is not impossible to imagine in a salamander.
Yes.
But it is much easier to imagine in a lizard.
Absolutely.
That lizards, lizards have scales.
Yes.
And scales are already a tough, protective material.
Mm-hmm.
There are already scales that can grow into longer, spine-like shapes. Feathers are not necessarily derived from reptilian scales, but they are built in a very similar way and built of a very similar thing, and they grow into these sort of fibrous shapes. Many lizards also have osteoderms, which are bones that grow in the skin, and bone, that's straight up minerals. That is just mineralized chunks in your skin. So if we had something like a lizard whose scales and or osteoderms evolved in such a way that they incorporate mineral from the surrounding environment, it could even be that these are minerals that are common in geothermally active places, that this is some sort... I off the top of my head, I don't know what the asbestos minerals are. This doesn't necessarily have to be exactly asbestos, but it can be a mineral that grows very similar.
And has similar properties.
That might be made of amphibole and stuff that grows in those similar fibrous ways. It is also not unheard of for animals to incorporate new minerals into existing structures.
Yes.
We've talked about this with shrews that grow iron into their teeth. I think Dave Marshall many years ago taught us about scorpions and certain arthropods that will extra mineralize certain parts of their exoskeleton.
Yeah, scorpion stingers have metal focused in the tip.
They're a little extra metallic.
To strengthen that piercing appendage.
So these could be...
I do like that. That's cool.
Scales and or osteoderms that have incorporated these fibrous minerals and grow them as part of the body. It could also be, if those are minerals that grow in those volcanic type areas, it could be yet another incentive for those animals to be hanging around there because that's where they're getting those minerals.
Absolutely.
They're either eating food, they might be literally eating at the dirt to get those minerals into the system.
Yep.
They might be eating the bugs that live in that area, which have incorporated those minerals in there. Or they could be positioning themselves as nucleation points. Like, if it sits in a place for long enough, those naturally occurring minerals, or if it burrows through the sediment, those naturally occurring minerals might accumulate on the existing foundation on the body.
Yeah, that they can have structures in their scales that encourage the nucleation and growth of these minerals. There are symbiotic marine animals that have that for things like corals or sponges to grow on parts of their body, that they have a special structure to that part, usually like crabs and stuff.
Those are animals that, like a lot of marine animals, also build their shells out of mineral components in the water.
Yes.
They make a calcium carbonate shell. That is not something that vertebrate animals do nearly as commonly.
but it's not a biological impossibility.
Yeah, if we're stretching our spooky biology bounds a little bit, we can certainly imagine it.
Yeah, I do. It is pretty. It's also a fun option to go because it's going with the weirder medieval versions of salamanders.
Well, that's the fun part.
Yeah.
Now, and it could be something that exists complementary to some sort of mucous membrane.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that they secrete some sort of fluid that also helps the mineralization process happen. That it is depositing and precipitating those minerals in that integument.
Yep.
As they're going. Before we mentioned, salamanders are very good at secreting mucuses and stuff, but if we want to go with lizards can also release secretions. And I'm also, and this is not a thing I know a whole lot of details about, but I know that when lizards and snakes shed, they do produce a special fluid that helps to separate the layers of skin before
the
they
old
shed
layer
it.
and the new layer.
So it could be born out of that kind of process of you're already an animal that produces a specialized secretion for the purpose of replenishing your outer integument. This could be a repurposing of that to secrete your ingested mineral components out across your body that helps the minerals grow and also is, gooey wetness that can add an extra layer of protection against heat.
I also like that because, salamanders and amphibians also will shed their skin, but it doesn't usually get left behind as a skin because their skin isn't as tough as reptile skin is.
Right.
Like reptile skin, there's a reason we can make leather out of reptile skin because their skin's tough. So their skin stays together. That's why you can find a snake skin and lizard skins. So I like that in this case because it means that you could get a shed plumage.
Yes, you get like a patch of it.
Of the salamander. And if it's something that they renew at certain times, and if it syncs up with the fires at times and syncs up with moments like that, then the fire's renewing their skin.
Yeah.
A newly shed salamander is after you commonly see that after a fire.
Yeah. Well, I could see that either being the heat is what helps their body to do that process, that they need that extra heat and energy to do the process. But also I could totally see it being if you stuck around by the fire, that resistant outer barrier that you've put up gets damaged and they have to shed it after it gets burned a little bit because now it's weakened on the outer layer and you have to start shedding that.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking, is that maybe if there's something that kind of uses it up, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that does fit that myth very well.
Also, hanging out by fire for an animal that is extremely well adapted to do that is an effective defense against predators.
Yes.
That's another benefit that we didn't mention before. If you're hanging out by the fire, this is already an organism that seems to have multiple layers of defense that I can't imagine these would be a good idea to eat.
No.
If they're covered in these little sort of fibrous minerals and stuff.
Yeah, and being able to wait out a fire. We talked about that in the hibernation episode, that brumation and daily hibernation might be a tool for surviving fires, both for being able to wait out the bad time in a safe place, but also a lot of hibernators can let their body temperature rise with the local temperature, so that they're not having to fight to keep themselves cool and worry about overheating as much.
Yeah, I do like your suggestion of that they are burrowing into a space and waiting for the heat from flame to sort of warm them up, help them get activated, and then they emerge and run away.
Yeah.
Right, and that shielding around them gives them that little bit of extra protection. That leads to that myth description of there's a fire, they start to appear. It wasn't there before. And then the fire happened and it emerged and ran off.
Well, and if it's not a intense forest fire, they might also be able to just wait out the fire underground. So that, when you come to a burned forest, the only animals you find are salamanders.
Yeah.
There's salamanders all over picking out the bugs that are left around, and they seem perfectly fine and are just sitting on a burnt log. And it's
still smoldering.
The only way you could have been here is if you were here the whole time. and the fire didn't touch you, which you're right, but you're misunderstanding how they did that.
Yes.
Yeah, they can just bunker down, and if it gets too intense, then they can flee, and they can risk it because they have that fire protection. But if it's not too intense, then yeah, just hunker down underground. Also, hunkering down underground means they could get to those minerals, like being burrowing animals.
Well, especially if they're hanging out there for a longer period of time.
Or if they're eating subterranean stuff, that might be getting some of those minerals in. So
I also like that if they are producing a special form of mineral on their body, and if they're producing that mucus or secretion of some kind, that also fits very nicely with them being ingredients in witches' potions.
Yes.
That there could be medicinal benefits to these secretions and stuff that they're making if prepared the right way.
Yeah. Oh man, if they're burrowers and stuff, that also would explain why they come out during heavy storms.
That's true.
Because the soil gets flooded.
Yeah, you're going to drown under
they come out just like worms do. So you could see that as well.
That's pretty cool.
I like our weird furry lizards.
So far, the only thing that I don't have an answer to is the myth of them putting out fires.
I was thinking about that. The only idea I came up with potentially is their skin. If you throw a shed skin from a salamander in a fire, it's not necessarily going to put it out, but it will make it hard to start that fire, or it doesn't burn and it smolders fires or something. That you could use that basically to put out a small fire, like a fire blanket, just to smother a small fire or something.
Yeah. One thought that I had early on was, what if it's just that so many salamanders congregate around a fire that it crowds out the fire? Mm-hmm. But also the thought that I could see them with that, especially with that secretion that they're making, that they would be cooler in temperature, and coming out of a fire would be surprisingly cold. Mm-hmm. And that could easily give rise to some of that myth that it runs out of a fire and somebody grabs it and expects it to be hot, but it's not because it has that outer layer. Could be that, they're cold. They're always cold, which isn't actually true. Also, if their fibrous scales are functioning at all like fur, it could also help keep them warm.
Yeah.
It could be a little bit of a thermoregulatory, not only to protect from fire, but to maintain their internal body heat when they get it. I like this salamander. Yeah. Now, I think that given all the stuff we said, I think a lizard works really well.
Yes.
I'm so sorry to make it not an actual salamander.
Yeah, it's as satisfying as it would be to make it a salamander, there's a lot that just doesn't sync up well with their anatomy.
Sure, and I like this lizardy direction that we've gone, because that also can separate them from water much more easily. That they can be in dry environments much more easily, where you're more likely to get regular forest fires and stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely.
It does raise a question that I don't always ponder in scenarios like this, but in this case I can, and that is, what type of lizard is it?
Yeah.
And my first thought is some kind of skink.
That was where my brain definitely had been defaulting to, and I didn't realize that until you asked.
Yep.
But absolutely.
I think it might be a skink because A, they're everywhere. Mm-hmm. B, they're often very small. C, osteoderms.
Osteoderms.
They've got osteoderms,
it's very
which can
convenient.
Incorporate into those fibrous projections. Also, they are often very salamander-like.
Yes, absolutely.
Living in the sediment, digging around in leaf litter and stuff like that. So a little fire skink.
Yeah, I like that. Because initially I was wondering if it would be a venomous lizard to add into the toxin and poisonous, which we could, but that is a more aggressive use of their toxin than the salamander was portrayed as.
Yeah, and it is in the myths. It is not biting and stuff like that.
It's like a biochemical threat, not a attack.
So the idea that you shouldn't get too close to it or touch it because you might get irritation on the skin because it's got those little and now I'm thinking like a tarantula hairs.
The urticating hairs on a tarantula, absolutely.
So those fibers act as little irritants, and if you breathe them in or eat them, they can be irritants inside of your body.
Mm-hmm. Well, you could even have the lizards have a reaction that releases, like that
Yeah,
shakes
they do
its body.
a little shake.
And it puffs a bunch out. And so it's like, yeah. You don't actually even have to touch them. If you get too close and breathe in the cloud they create, that could be enough to send you to the hospital, buddy.
I like that also fits with the breathing toxic gas idea. That they act like those hairs. That's cool.
Yeah.
I like our little salamander.
Little fuzzy lizard salamander. I like it. I like it a lot. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's pretty cool. A little skinkamander.
Just little scurrying biohazards.
Yes. Little skink-like lizards whose osteoderms and or scales have developed into more fiber-like, like feathers or proto-feathers or fur, structures that incorporate fibrous minerals from their surroundings, which can be released intentionally or unintentionally as an irritant, but also if it gets in your face or if it gets in your water supply and you start taking it into your body, it can cause actual illness and sickness and problems, especially in people who are extra susceptible to it.
Yes.
And they use that outer fibrous covering along with special bodily secretions to form a barrier against intense heat, which is helpful because they live in environments where they find themselves often close to and seeking out fire to eat the things that live in the fire, to warm up their bodies so that they can be active, and to defend themselves against predators who might be around looking for them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it also does raise the question of what horrible creature in the Spooky-verse is hunting these.
Right?
Yeah, something that has developed an immunity to the little asbestos fibers.
The asbestos eater.
Yes, the asbestos monger.
Yeah, no. It's... Well, and I also love picturing within our Spooky-verse people having to have... It's like the Anastasia's not a Disney movie conversation of like,
yes,
you guys have salamanders here? So yeah, we got salamanders.
Yeah,
what
actual, like the real ones.
This is a salamander.
Fuzzy old lobsters.
Salamanders.
Yep. Also, thinking about our Spooky-verse together, I can see our gremlins collecting salamanders and putting them in places where people will encounter them.
Throwing salamanders at people. I could also see them being in the similar environments that the dragons feeding around fires would be in.
That's true. Absolutely.
This would definitely be, if they're taking advantage of fires, these would also be great environments for these salamanders to be surviving.
Yes.
Cool.
Very cool. That's awesome.
All right.
Well, there we go. We got salamanders.
Number 3, fuzzy little lizard salamanders.
Tiny monsters.
If you have ideas for how to evolve a salamander, if you have a way to make a salamander,
oh, sure,
we would love to hear it.
Yeah, let us know what your speculative evolution musings are.
We have a channel on the Discord specifically for Spook-E, so feel free to join there. You can find links to the Discord. You can also just message us or email us your thoughts. If you would like to, if you are so inspired to draw a representation of any of the creatures we've been evolving here on the show, please share them. We love to see fan art of the Spook-E creations. If you're open for us to put them up on our website, we have a fan art page and part of it dedicated to Spook-E. Just let us know that you're cool with that and how you'd like to be credited. If you post it somewhere else other than like the Discord or email, just tag us in the tags and we'll check it out because we are always excited to see what creative renditions. As we often say, we don't know what our Spook-E creations look like until someone draws them.
Yes. Very cool. That is 3 Spookies down. 1 more to go for the last Saturday in October. And then QD.
Yeah.
And then a Spook-E live stream on November 9th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Everyone is welcome, patron or not, to join us for the Spook-E live stream and to have a little after Spook-E chat.
Stay tuned for those and see what's next.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.